Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marc-Antoine Carrera da Cruz, and I am the new Sense and Elect project manager in charge of railway standardization. I have the pleasure to welcome you in this brand new series of podcasts dedicated to harmonized standards in the rail sector. European railway standardization is at a crossing road with a new standardization request, new rules of assessment for harmonized standards, and a new template of Annex ZA ZZ for harmonized standards. Working group experts responsible for the development of harmonized standards face growing challenges and requirements due to the evolution of the legal framework surrounding harmonized standards and the way it affects the assessment process of the harmonized standards. In this context, the role of the Annex ZA ZZ, so the metrics used in the harmonized standard to allow the linkage between the clauses of the standard and the European railway legislation, is become crucial. Consequently, the quality of the drafting of this Annex ZA ZZ is highly scrutinized and is a key factor in the decision of accepting the standard in the EU legislation. As the requirements on the quality drafting of this annex are stronger, there is a growing need of explanation on what is the new yardstick for the annex and what is the methodology to follow in order to reach a proper drafting in line with this yardstick. This requires dedicated training through an adequate pedagogy. This series of podcasts is intended to the expert working on the development of railways harmonized standards. It provides the necessary background, explanation, and training to apply a proper way of preparing an Annex ZA/ZZ when drafting a standard. It is organized in 4 sessions, allowing to tackle both the framework and the practical points to consider when preparing harmonized standards. The first session is dedicated to the European Commission explanation of the global legal framework. The second session focuses specifically on the TSI and the place of the harmonized standards in the TSI. The third session will introduce the methodology to follow when preparing the Annex ZA/ZZ. And finally, the fourth session will be a role-playing of drafting an Annex ZA/ZZ. But today, we have the pleasure to welcome Bertrand Collignon, presenting the first session of this series of podcasts. This first session is on the European Commission explanation of the global legal framework on railway standards, the system of assessment, and the legislation. Let me introduce our speaker. After nearly 20 years of experience in the industry and in international organization, Bertrand Collignon joined the European Commission in November 2015 as policy officer in DG Move, Rail Safety and Interoperability Unit, in charge of interoperability issues, standardization, and the relations with notified bodies. With the technical support of the European Union Agency for Railways, the ERA, and of the Shift to Rail joint undertaking, the unit of Bertrand identifies the needs for standardization in the railway sector and follows the development of the related standards by the ESOs. It is also responsible for the publication of the list of railway harmonized standards in the official journal of the European Union. In 2016, Bertrand and his colleagues of the unit also launched the Railway Standardization Coordination Platform for Europe, the RASCOP, with the objective to facilitate the coordination and streamlining of the activities of all relevant stakeholders active in the EU in the development of European and international standards and other technical documents related to the railway sector. So the floor is yours, Bertrand.
Thank you, Marc-Antoine, and hello, everybody. Indeed, as Marc-Antoine was saying, there's been a lot of talk about annexes ZA, ZZ in recent months, And one of the reasons for that is that these annexes were previously drafted with a lot of support of the so-called new approach consultants, if not drafted by the consultants themselves. But in a few court cases, among other one which is quite well known, which is the so-called James Elliott case of October 2016, the Court of Justice of the European Union asked the Commission to be stricter in the application of its legislation for standard harmonization. And this was related, among others, to two specific aspects. The way the Commission manages the consultants, so the so-called previously new approach consultants, and avoids conflicts of interest for these consultants. And that's why the Commission had to set up a new regime with a so-called now HAS consultant, Harmonized Standards consultant. And the fact that these consultants now are not allowed to draft or provide pieces of drafting of the standards themselves or also of the annexes Z to make sure that they are there to assess the standards and the annexes and don't have conflicts of interest by both assessing them and drafting them. And also, as Marc-Antoine said, there's a request to be more precise in the description of what these standards provide presumption of conformity to through this description in the annexes ZA, ZZ. So that means that it's an additional work for the European standardization organizations through their conveners and the experts working on the standards. And obviously, that's something where we need to work together to make sure that we are well aligned on how to draft these annexes Z, when, and with appropriate support when needed from the Commission, from the European Union Agency for Railways, ERA. And as part of these adjustments and activities on the way to prepare annexes ZA-ZZ, I would like to get back to the basics somehow, to start this series of podcasts and to come back to what are harmonized standards and annexes ZZ, ZA, what are they there for? And when is an annex ZA, ZZ needed? Which questions shall we ask ourselves when drafting a new standard or an updated version of the standard? These are the questions we will look at together now in the following minutes. So you have here the agenda, which will look through these questions: standardization need versus legal status, the challenge of drafting these standards, drafting the annexes, and how and when to do it. Now, what are harmonized standards and what is their legal status? What are standardization needs? Basically, when a standardization organization starts working on a standard, it can have mainly three different statuses. Either it is a standard that is supporting what we call the EU harmonization legislation. In the railway sector, this is the interoperability directive, which was published in 2016 now, so the Interop Directive 2016. And standards which are harmonized are there to support the implementation of the directive and also of the technical specifications for interoperability, which give more detailed requirement for fulfilling the interoperability directive. And so these standards which support the harmonization legislation, the directive, are called harmonized standards, and they can have two statuses. Either they are referenced in the TSIs themselves, and by then their application becomes mandatory. When you manufacture a product, you have to apply these standards if you want your product to be conform to the TSI and to the directive. Or they are listed in the official journal of the EU, and they have then an annex ZA-ZZ in order to provide presumption of conformity to certain clauses of a TSI. And in this case, they are not of mandatory application. they can be applied or not. It's the choice of the manufacturer, of the applicant for an authorization for placing its product on the market. And which kind of standards do we make mandatory? Which ones do we make more voluntary? This is something we are working on redefining and clarifying together with Sen and Senelec colleagues and with ERA. But basically, one could say that mandatory standards are the ones which are going to define the interfaces between vehicle infrastructure, between different equipment or functions of a vehicle, or standards which are linked to safety issues, and thus for which we want to define that this specific standard has to be applied if a product is to be conform. Voluntary standards are standards which define ways to fulfill other requirements of the TSIs and of the essential requirements of the directive, but where this is one possible way of fulfilling these requirements and not a mandatory one. So these ones are called as providing presumption of conformity to specific requirements, and they are listed in the official journal and also mentioned in the ERA application guides for the TSIs. The ERA application guide is providing additional context and explanation on why and how these standards shall be used, but what is giving the legal value of the standard is its listing in the official journal together with the Annex Z. These are for the standards which have a direct link to the legislation, which provides support to the legislation. But of course, when a manufacturer designs and manufactures his products, he's also following a lot of other standards, which helps him follow best practice, follow the state of the art, ensure that his product will be efficient, will be cost effective. And these standards are also used and very important for the manufacturers and developed by Sen and Senelec, but those ones are not directly linked to the legislation, so they are not harmonized standards, and they are not the standards that we are looking at from Commission ERA point of view when we look at which standards should be harmonized, whether they are correctly fulfilling the needs that we have from these standards to support the legislation. Now, a difficulty in the work that we have of working together to make sure that we have the best legislative framework and the best standards for the sector, for the manufacturers, for the railway undertakings and all the users of the railway system in the EU, is that we have on one side the TSIs, which are developed through a drafting process by the ERA, the European Union Agency for Railways, and then their adoption process from the Commission. So that's one process where you have regular revisions of the TSIs, regular improvements, adding new functions, changing some things and adding new requirements. That has its own process with its own life cycle. And then in parallel, we have the life cycle that you know very well, which is the life cycle of the development of the Sen, Senelec, and ETSI standards, which are also following specific formal process with specific time delays and time lines. And these two, as these are different processes from different organizations which are independent the one from the other, these two are not fully aligned. So we have a challenge to make sure that when we update the TSIs, bring new requirements, new functions within the TSIs, the related standards have to be updated. And in the same way, when you update a standard, it's important that from the TSI, we know what's coming on, and we also can, in the development of the TSIs, take this into account so that the two remain as aligned as possible. So this is a challenge because we have independent processes, but we need to work together as much as possible and as much upfront in the development of the TSI on one hand and in the development of the standards on the other to make sure that we keep the two aligned and efficient for the users, for the manufacturers and everyone who is using the system. And that's why together with ERA, with the agency, and with participation of Sensenelec, we have set up earlier this year the so-called ERA Topical Working Group on Standardization, where we look at these issues, and we will talk about it a bit later. Now, coming more concretely into the drafting of standards and the drafting of annexes ZA, ZZ, there's a certain number of questions that we can ask ourselves when we want to draft a new standard and when we want to know whether that standard should be harmonized, whether we would need to draft an annex ZA, ZZ for that standard or not. The first question is, when should a standard be harmonized? Well, based on the definition that we saw together before in a previous slide, a standard should be harmonized when it is a useful and appropriate support to a specific part of the technical specification for interoperability, or sometimes directly to the Interoperability Directive, Directive EU 2016/797. And how do we know that? Well, there's one very simple way. It should be harmonized if it is requested by a standardization request. Now, the standardization request is something that has to be done for each interoperability directive. And so for the new Interoperability Directive 2016/797, we are busy right now together with Commission, ERA, Sensenelec, the TC 256, TC9X, also with Shift2Rail, to prepare a new standardization request. And in this standardization request, in the preparation, we are looking at the list of all existing standards and all the standards, new standards we will need in the coming years. We are trying to agree with Sen and Senelec to which standards should be there. And part of that standardization request will be saying which standards should be harmonized and what are the requirements that they should fulfill. So once the standardization request will be available, that will be the first place to look to know if a standard should be harmonized or not. As it's not yet the case, we have an old mandate, but this is quite old. So when it's not clear for you whether a standard has to be harmonized or not, the best place to go is this ERA Topical Working Group on Standardization that I just mentioned before. And for that, as the representatives of the TC9X, TC256 are members, and CCMC also is a member of this topical working group, the best thing is to look with the representatives from CCMC, so Marc-Antoine, who kindly introduced me for this, this presentation today, or from TC256 now, Cliff Cork, the chairman of the TC, is a very active member of the group. And for TC9X, Denis Miglianico, the secretary of TC9X, is also there working regularly with us. When should we ask ourselves this question? Well, that's something I will come up regularly, as early as possible and at the beginning of the drafting updating process of the standard. And I will explain a bit more later why this is important to do it as early as possible. A second question we can ask ourselves is, to which TSI clauses should the standard provide conformity if it's a mandatory one, or presumption of conformity if it's a voluntary one? And how do we know it? Here again, in the standardization request that we are preparing, we will as much as possible clarify what are the needs we have for the different standards which are listed and to which requirements they should help provide conformity or presumption of conformity. Again, if what is in the standardization request is not sufficient, or if it's not there yet, and if you have questions, if you're not sure, then again, go through the ERA Topical Working Group on Standardization. That's really the place to discuss and to organize these exchanges and these discussions. And again, when to ask ourselves this question, the best is to do it at the beginning of the drafting, updating process of the standard. Indeed, the working group convener and the experts, when they are drafting a standard that should support the legislation, when it's been agreed between Commission, ERA, and Sen and Senelec, it's important that you have a clear idea from the beginning of which TSI requirements the standard should fulfill. And this is indeed the best and most efficient way to ensure a good result in the end. The objective by doing that and by saying you should do that at the beginning is not to give more work to the working groups, but to facilitate that work by taking account of what is needed from a legislative point of view from the beginning, so you don't have to redo things afterwards. Then once you know that the standard has to be harmonized, you know which requirements it has to provide conformity to. Another question to ask is whether that standard should be a voluntary standard or if it should be of mandatory application to get the conformity, and whether an Annex ZA, Annex ZZ is needed. Because actually not all harmonized standards need an Annex ZZ. Whether it's mandatory or voluntary, this is a decision from the Commission. But of course, our objective is to agree with the sector, with the standardization organization, and to do that on a consensus based. This is currently discussed during the preparation of the standardization request and can be further discussed and clarified in the area topical working group as for all the things we're discussing today. The principle now for whether an Annex ZZ is needed is that for parts of the standard which are of mandatory application, which are directly referenced in the TSIs, it's the TSI that specify what part of the standard provides then conformity to what part of the TSI. It's written in the TSI, so there's no need to have an Annex ZA/ZZ. So for these parts which are referenced in the TSI, there's no need to mention them in the Annex ZA/ZZ. For parts of the standards which are of voluntary application and providing presumption of conformity, there these ones are not directly referenced in the TSI, so we need to specify and give the legal status of that standard through a description of what it provides presumption of conformity to in the Annex ZA/ZZ. So in that case, the Annex ZA/ZZ is necessary and shall mention this relation of providing presumption of conformity between a clause of the standard and a requirement, a clause of the TSI. So that means that there should be no duplication. The link, each link between a standard clause and a TSI clause shall be indicated either in the TSI, in case it is of mandatory application for this specific aspect, or in the Annex ZZ, in case it is a voluntary application. This shall not be done in the two places. And why that? Simply for clarity purposes. People who use the TSIs, use the standards, will know very easily that for what is a voluntary application, where they can choose to apply it or not, it's indicated in the Annex ZA. For everything that is mandatory, it is indicated in the TSI. And further explanations of the relations between specific clauses, if need be, can also be provided in the ERA application guide, but the application guide by itself doesn't provide it a legal value, a legal force. It gives additional indication, information, guidelines, and it's very useful, but that's not what gives the legal value. Then once we know that the standard has to be harmonized, we know whether it shall be mandatory or voluntary, whether we need to draft an Annex ZA, and we know that we need to draft one. Again, this should be done as early as possible in the process. And why that? In order to ensure that the standard fulfills its role, and in order to do it the best way possible, the best is to have an alignment between the structure of the standard and the structure of the requirements and of the TSIs, so that we can easily make the user who will use the standard for providing presumption of conformity or conformity to the TSI, more easily can see, okay, that part of the standard will allow me to provide conformity to that part of the TSI. And for everyone, this will facilitate the process. And also, if you know what you have to do, if the structure of the two documents are similar, it makes an easier drafting of the Annex ZA/ZZ. Then it's easy to make the link between one clause of the standard and one clause of the TSI. Another reason is that it will allow for the assessment of the standard, but also of the Annex ZAZZ by the Harmonized Standards consultants and by ERA from an early stage of the development of the standard, and preferably at least before the inquiry, so that if there are things to change, we still have time to do that, to discuss it, and to do that following all the formal processes and without being in a hurry and trying to force last-minute changes and make everything in a hurry, creating tensions between Commission and the standardization organization. Between everything takes time and we have no time anymore. And also it allows to make these changes at the inquiry level so that at the assessment before the formal vote, there might be still some few tweaks, but no substantial big issue to deal with at the last minute. So that's for the part of work for preparing the annexes ZAZZ that is on your side. Now, when you from a working group, convener, expert, you have drafted your standard, you have drafted the Annex ZA, made sure through the exchanges with the HAS consultant, with the Commission, that everything is in order. Then you have gone through the formal vote, published the standard. Then what happens? It's then, of course, our turn to take it. And in case of mandatory standards or standards that have mandatory parts, then it's our turn to take them over in the process from ERA for drafting the TSI recommendations. And then ERA is sending us these recommendations, sending us to the Commission. And we go to the formal process, the formal comitology process of adopting the TSIs, so that we have then an alignment between the new updated TSIs and the latest version of the standard. In case we have a voluntary standard or voluntary parts of standard providing presumption of conformity, then this published standard is again submitted by CCMC to the Commission. From Commission side, we have a final assessment after publication to confirm that we agree with the standard, we agree with the fact that it does provide presumption of conformity to the TSI. And for that, we have the support of ERA and of the HAS consultant if needed. But of course, if assessments have been done earlier on, usually that should be then only a confirmation that everything is okay. If indeed everything is okay, then we have a new Commission decision where we will list in the official journal of the EU this new version of the standard providing presumption of conformity. And if there is a need for further clarification on how this can be used, what is the relation of this standard with the TSI or with other standards, we can have also from ERA an update of the application guide if this is relevant. So this is what I wanted to give as a context, background, generic information and explanation about the role of the harmonized standards, why they are important, what are the questions you should ask yourselves when you draft a new standard, an updated version of the standard, to make sure that we have this alignment between the standard and the legislation, and that it is really useful, that we can take it over as a reference in our legislation, and that it is used by the sector and providing this conformity to the legislation to the sector. Now you have a last slide here as to where to find the related information. I don't know if Marc-Antoine will take over for a small conclusion, but from my side, that's what I wanted to tell today. And obviously through CCMC, through the TCs, you can always ask your questions, and we'll be available to discuss and try to answer all the needs you may have to facilitate this process of updating the harmonized standards and preparing the annexes ZA, ZZ. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand.